You wake up to a roar. Not an explosion, but the sky suddenly turning white, blinding you even through closed eyelids. Outside your window, where a moment ago there was a quiet Tokyo March evening, fire now dances. Not just flames, but a sticky, living hell engulfing the streets. Your home, rice paper walls, cedar partitions, a straw roof, ignites instantly like a gasoline-soaked match. You run barefoot through the street, but the flames are relentless. They don't just burn, they cling. To walls, to clothes, to skin, searing into flesh and continuing to burn even in the rain. You feel the heat rising to 1,000 degrees, the air turning into scorching smoke burning your lungs. People scream, but their voices are swallowed by the roar of the firestorm. This phenomenon, where hundreds of fires merge into a single vortex, sucks out oxygen and whips winds up to 150 miles per hour. This isn't a bombing. This is the arson of an entire city, and it was planned down to the last detail, in laboratories, on mock-ups, in military headquarters. You probably think this was a mistake of war, an accident, collateral damage, as military reports call it. But no, American scientists didn't just invent napalm. They specifically engineered its composition, gasoline mixed with the soap powder, to create a sticky gel that would cling to paper and wood, burning at 1,000 degrees Celsius. They knew that homes in Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto were built of rice paper and cedar, materials that ignite faster than dry straw. They knew these weren't just dwellings, they were fuel, packed into dense blocks with narrow streets. And they created a weapon that turned entire cities into bonfires. This wasn't a reaction to a threat. It was a calculation, a cold, precise engineering calculation, confirmed by tests on full-scale mock-ups in the Utah desert. By the end of this story, you will understand how a quiet Harvard laboratory, under the direction of chemist Louis Fiser, became a factory of fiery apocalypse. You will learn how a formula, conceived for igniting tanks, transformed into a tool for destroying 16 square miles of Tokyo in a single night, more than in Hiroshima. You will see how military engineers built copies of Japanese neighborhoods in Utah, using actual rice paper and cedar to test how quickly they would burn. And you will ask yourself, why did none of those who planned this, neither Fiser nor General Curtis LeMay nor the Pentagon analysts, ever face accountability? Why was victory deemed more important than conscience, and hundreds of thousands of innocent lives reduced to mere statistics of efficiency? It all began not in the Pentagon, but in a quiet Harvard laboratory. The year was 1942. Imagine a chemist, Louis Fiser. He had kind eyes and a genuine passion for experiments. Around him, an orderly arrangement of flasks, test tubes, and neat notes in notebooks. Outside, war raged, but Fiser was solving a specific engineering problem: how to make gasoline burn longer. Ordinary fuel just splatters, extinguishes, evaporates. He needed something more vicious, more persistent. And he found a solution, mixing gasoline with common soap powder. The result was a thick, sticky, repulsive mass. It adhered to any surface and burned at 1,000 degrees. He proudly named it napalm, from naphthenic and palmitic acids. In his notes from that year, there's a phrase: "We have created a means to protect our soldiers." He didn't yet know that in 3 years his formula would become a fire devouring children, killing 100,000 people in a single night. Napalm isn't just an incendiary, it's an engineering breakthrough in the art of arson. Understand the difference: ordinary gasoline runs off. It evaporates. It can be extinguished. Napalm, however, turns into a gel. It doesn't run, it engulfs wood, paper, human skin, and it burns. It burns so hot it melts aluminum. It's impossible to extinguish with water. Water only makes it splatter and spread further like a living, hungry entity. It was this property that made it an ideal weapon against Japanese cities. Their homes, light paper walls, wooden frames, they didn't just burn, they ignited. The fire instantly leapt from one roof to another, creating infernos no one could control. This wasn't an explosion, it was arson on an industrial scale. According to US Air Force calculations, one B-29 bomber could incinerate an entire 10-hectare block. And here's where it gets interesting. Louis Fiser had no idea what his formula was truly being prepared for. He was creating a weapon against tanks, warehouses, military installations. But by 1944, strategists in Washington had grasped the full picture. Japan's real vulnerability wasn't its factories, but its people. The workers who lived in those paper homes and toiled in thousands of small workshops scattered throughout residential areas. At that moment, Napalm ceased to be a tactical weapon. It became a weapon of mass terror. Fiser only learned of this after the war from newspapers. He was horrified, but his invention had already killed more people in Tokyo in a single night than the first atomic bomb in Hiroshima. The chasm between scientific discovery and its consequences proved bottomless, so napalm left the laboratory walls. But an ideal weapon alone wasn't enough. An ideal target was needed, and they found it. Not on maps of military bases, but on urban development maps. American analysts studied Japan as a system, searching for its weakest point, and they found it in the most mundane things, in homes, in streets, in the materials from which millions of people built their lives. Archival Pentagon data showed Tokyo's building density reached 80%. Every house stood flush against its neighbour. The next step was absolutely logical and monstrously precise. If you want to know how quickly a city will burn, you must first build it. Exactly. In a quiet Pentagon office under the glow of desk lamps, analysts pored over aerial photographs of Tokyo. On the table lay not only maps, there were samples of rice paper, pieces of cedar wood, blueprints of sanded Japanese homes, and one of the officers uttered a phrase that explained everything. "These aren't homes, this is fuel." You must understand this. They didn't see families behind those walls. They saw combustible mass, tightly packed into blocks. Every house was a kindling stick in a huge bonfire, and if one caught fire, all would burn. Their task wasn't to destroy an army, their task was to destroy the very possibility of living in these cities. A report from March 1944 explicitly stated, Japan's urban infrastructure was an ideal target for incendiary attacks. Military engineers reached a simple conclusion: Japan's wooden neighborhoods were a ready-made trap. Dense construction, narrow streets, lack of fire breaks all created ideal conditions for a firestorm. Imagine hundreds of fires merging into one giant vortex, temperatures inside reaching 1500 degrees, winds accelerating to 150 miles per hour. It feeds on itself, sucking oxygen from everything around it. People suffocate even if they aren't burning. A firestorm isn't just a fire, it's a man-made natural disaster. And US Air Force meteorologists calculated, with building density above 60%, the probability of a firestorm exceeded 90%. This wasn't chance, this was mathematics. And here's the turning point. By 1945, Japan could no longer wage war. Its fleet was destroyed. Its air force barely existed. Factories idled due to resource shortages. But the cities remained full of people, and they were chosen as the target, not because they posed a threat, but because they could be burned. This wasn't a military necessity, it was a choice to kill not soldiers, but mothers, children, the elderly, because it was effective, because it was easy. Internal Pentagon memoranda from January 1945 clearly stated, the objective is the demoralization of the population through the total destruction of residential areas. But theory is one thing. It was necessary to verify whether napalm could truly destroy an entire block in minutes. And so the Americans built not maps, not models, they built actual copies of Japanese homes, in the Utah desert, under the open sky, to see with their own eyes how flames would consume what was once someone's home. Tests were conducted in 1943 and 44. The results were so compelling that generals immediately altered the entire bombing strategy. Imagine this: the Utah desert, 1943, the sun blazes. Engineers in protective goggles look not at it, but at an exact replica of a Tokyo neighborhood. Homes made of real rice paper, straw roofs, cedar partitions, everything brought from Japan, everything authentic. One of them gives a signal. A bomb falls from the sky. A flash. In 3 seconds, the entire mock-up transforms into a fiery hell. Flames leap from house to house as if connected by an invisible thread. Engineers calmly take notes. They don't see tragedy. They see success. A report from August 17, 1943 states, a single B-29 raid is capable of destroying 8 to 12 hectares of residential development. These tests provided an unequivocal answer. Napalm destroys a wooden neighborhood faster than any other compound. A single bomber, dropping several clusters, could incinerate an area of several hectares, and the density of construction in Japanese cities meant the fire would spread like an avalanche. The military calculated to halt production in thousands of small workshops, it was enough to burn the surrounding residential areas. Workers would die, factories would cease operation, the objective achieved, without a single strike against an industrial target. This logic formed the basis of a new doctrine, economic destruction through civilian infrastructure. But that's not the most chilling part. The most chilling part is that they built these mock-ups using actual materials imported from Japan. Not an imitation, not a substitute, real rice paper, real cedar. This means one thing: the destruction wasn't an assumption. It was planned down to the last nail. The Americans didn't hope the cities would burn, they knew, they tested, they confirmed, and only then did they give the order. The engineering reports from Utah became the foundation for Operation Mephistopheles, named after the demon who tempts souls. Now they had everything: the weapon, the target, confirmed effectiveness. All that remained was to find the person who would turn calculations into reality, a general who decided that war wasn't a battle of armies, but the extermination of peoples. His name was Curtis LeMay, and he changed everything. He abandoned pinpoint strikes. He chose fire, total, ruthless. Imagine his office. Guam, February 1945. A map of Tokyo hung on the wall. On the desk lay reports from Utah, dry figures confirming that paper and cedar burned perfectly. LeMay, a man with a face carved from granite, made his decision. He cancelled daytime bombings. He ordered flights at night, at extremely low altitudes, without machine guns to carry more napalm. His target wasn't factories. His target was residential areas. He knew this would kill tens of thousands, and he uttered a phrase that explained everything. If we lose this war, we'll be prosecuted as war criminals. If we win, we'll be hailed as heroes. He chose the path of a hero. On March 9th, he signed the order. His tactic was a revolution in the art of killing. B-29 bombers were to drop napalm from an altitude of just 1,500 meters, 10 times lower than usual. This allowed them to slip under radar and bypass anti-aircraft defenses, which were configured for high-altitude interception. At night, precision didn't matter. The target wasn't a point, but an entire district. Incendiary clusters opened in the air, scattering hundreds of small bombs. Each one turned a single house into a torch. The fire spread so rapidly that firefighters couldn't even deploy. The city became a fire trap. In a single night, 1,665 tons of napalm were dropped on Tokyo. Pilots didn't target factories. They targeted the neighborhoods where workers lived. Schools, markets, temples. This was a conscious choice to kill not the army, but those who fed it. But even that was a lie. Many of the areas they incinerated had no connection to military industry. These were simply neighborhoods where people lived. They were destroyed not for victory. They were destroyed to demonstrate power, to intimidate, so that Japan would surrender not on the battlefield, but amidst the ashes of its cities. LeMay would later say, "We killed women and children, but war is hell." Everything was ready. The weapon, the tactics, the target. All that remained was to press the button. And on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, Operation Mephistopheles began. 334 bombers took off from Guam. In their bomb bays, over 1,500 tons of napalm. They weren't flying to war, they were flying to cremate an entire city. In a single night, 80 to 130,000 people died. More than in Hiroshima, more than on any other single day of World War II, and all of it, by design, Tokyo, 2 a.m. The air was still calm but heavy with foreboding. A woman wakes to a hum, not explosions, no, but a strange growing roar, as if the sky itself were tearing apart, the sound of 279 bombers flying at an altitude of just 3,000 feet. She runs out into the street in her cotton kimono, barefoot, a child in her arms, and then she sees it. The horizon is ablaze, not individual houses, the entire city. Fire rolls through the streets like a living beast, devouring paper, wood, flesh. The air is superheated to 1,000 degrees, a temperature at which skin chars in seconds. People run to the canals, to the water. She runs, but the fire is faster. It clings, to skin, to hair, to lungs. There is no water left in the canals, only steam and screams. Thousands of people crowd together, suffocating, drowning not in water, but in their own fear. She holds her child above the surface, but even there the fire finds them. Because napalm cannot be extinguished. It burns until it has consumed everything. That night, 80 to 130,000 people died, more than in Hiroshima. How did 279 planes destroy a city in a single night? The answer lies in the synergy of technology and tactics. Each B-29 carried 6 tons of incendiary bombs. Not just fire, but a sticky burning mass that adhered to any surface. The formula, created by Fiser, included gasoline and soap powder, precisely so the mixture would stick to rice paper and cedar, materials from which 90% of Tokyo's homes were built. They flew low. They didn't target factories. They targeted neighborhoods. The first wave of bombs ripped open roofs, exposing wooden rafters. The second wave ignited them. Then the fire began to live its own life. It merged into a firestorm, a vortex of superheated air that sucked oxygen from lungs and turned streets into furnaces. In 3 hours, they destroyed 16 square miles of the city. It was the most destructive air raid in human history. Imagine, you hear the word Hiroshima, and immediately you see a mushroom cloud. But do you know that more people died in a single night in Tokyo without a single nuclear charge? This was a calculation, a cold, precise engineering calculation, confirmed by tests in the Utah desert. There, American engineers already knew one bomber could destroy an entire block. Generals, including Curtis LeMay, consciously chose a tactic of total fire, not as a last resort, but as an optimal strategy. They knew to break Japan, there was no need to storm cities, it was enough to set them ablaze, as if they were built of matches. But what happens when the war ends and the ashes haven't yet cooled? Who bears responsibility for a fire that killed more than an atomic bomb? After Hiroshima, the world spoke of morality, of the limits of war. But after Tokyo, there was silence. Why? Because it wasn't an act of desperation, but an act of strategy. And strategy, it turned out, was not subject to judgment. Those who created and used napalm justified themselves with one word: necessity. But can the killing of 100,000 people be called necessary? Especially when documents show by March 1945, Japan was already on the verge of collapse. General Curtis LeMay sits at his desk in his office. The year is 1965. He is retired. Before him, a book of memoirs. He writes, "If we had lost the war, I would have been prosecuted as a war criminal." A pause. Then he adds, "But we won." In his voice, no regret, no doubt, only certainty. Louis Fiser, the Harvard laboratory chemist who created napalm in 1942, speaks just as calmly. "We did our job, we served our country. No one cries, no one asks for forgiveness. They don't see the faces of those they burned. They see only maps, numbers, targets. And in this lies the most terrible tragedy, not cruelty but indifference. Because when a person stops seeing other people, they are ready to burn an entire city, without even blinking. Without even hearing the ringing in their ears from the screams in the canals. Why are the bombings of Tokyo, Osaka and Nagoya not considered war crimes, unlike the Holocaust or even the use of the atomic bomb? The answer lies in the double standards of the post-war world. The victors determined what constituted legitimate warfare. They wrote history and laws to suit themselves. And strategic bombings, especially against so-called industrial centres, were deemed permissible, even if 90% of the victims were civilians. International law of that time, including the Hague Conventions of 1907, contained no direct prohibition against attacking cities. It was written for wars of the past, for battles of armies, not for total annihilation. Furthermore, the US itself refused to ratify the Geneva Conventions on the protection of civilians until 1977. So legally, everything was within bounds. But morally, morality has no court. It lives in memory, and in silence, in a silence that lasted for decades. Try to find a monument to the victims of the Tokyo bombings in Washington, or in New York, or anywhere in the United States. You won't find one. There's no memorial, no museum, not even a plaque. While exhibitions dedicated to the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki exist worldwide, hundreds of thousands burned alive in Tokyo, Osaka and Nagoya have simply vanished from American historical memory. This isn't forgetfulness. It's a choice not to remember. Because to acknowledge them means to admit that victory was bought not only with courage, but with ashes, and not just ashes, but ashes created from engineering blueprints, tested in the Utah desert, and realized in 1,665 tons of napalm in a single night. But napalm didn't disappear with the war. It didn't remain in the ashes of Tokyo. It waited, in arsenals, in formulas, in military doctrines, and 20 years later, it reappeared on the streets in another country with different faces, but with the same sticky, inextinguishable flame. The next chapter will show how a weapon born in a Harvard laboratory became a symbol of horror for a new generation, and how one photograph of a girl running down a highway with a burned back forever changed the world's view of war. South Vietnam, June 8, 1972. A girl runs down a highway. She is 9 years old, she wears no clothes, only rags burned by napalm. The skin on her back and arms is blistered like wax. She cries, but not from pain, from terror. Her name, Phan Thi Kim Phuc. This photograph, taken by Nick Ut, would circle the globe and win a Pulitzer Prize. It would become a symbol of war. But few know the napalm that burned her body was created using the same formulas in 1942 in the Harvard laboratory. The same mixture of gasoline and soap powder. The same properties, stickiness, a temperature of 1200 degrees, inextinguishability. Only now the victims were not Japanese but Vietnamese, and the target was not an empire but an ideology. But fire does not discriminate. It simply burns, and clings, and devours. Louis Fiser's formula remained almost unchanged until the 70s. The American Army used it in Korea, in Vietnam, in Latin America. Why wasn't it changed? Because it worked. Napalm effectively destroyed shelters, forests, villages, anything that burned. It was cheap to produce and simple to deploy, but most importantly it caused terror. And terror, it turned out, was part of the strategy, not just physical destruction, but psychological suppression. And although after Vietnam public opinion began to turn against napalm, the technology itself continued to exist, because war always finds a use for fire that does not extinguish, even when it burns children. And here's a turning point. The US officially renounced the use of napalm against civilian targets only in 1980, 35 years after Tokyo, and 8 years after the entire world saw the burned girl on the highway. 35 years. During that time, napalm killed, maimed, and disfigured tens of thousands of people. But it took an international scandal sparked by a single photograph for a weapon created in a Harvard laboratory to finally be deemed too cruel even for war. The question isn't why it took so long. The question is why a scandal was needed at all. Why weren't the silent screams from the Tokyo Canal sufficient reason? From Harvard to Tokyo, from Tokyo to Vietnam, from Vietnam to prohibition. This chain seems logical, almost inevitable. But behind each link stands a choice. The choice of a scientist who mixed gasoline and soap, the choice of a general who gave the order, the choice of a politician who remained silent. And now, as we approach the end of this story, one last question remains. What if someone had said no? What if an engineer had refused to mix gasoline and soap? What if a general had refused the order? History does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, but it demands an answer, and that answer lies in the next concluding chapter. It all began in a laboratory. With test tubes, formulas, calculations, American engineers studied Japanese homes, not to help, but to destroy. They built mockups in the Utah desert to verify, yes, paper burns, yes, wood ignites, yes, an entire block can be wiped out in a single raid. Then the generals made a decision, not to bomb factories, but to burn cities. Tactics became strategy, and strategy, a machine of destruction. After the war, no one was punished. On the contrary, many received awards, including LeMay, who became Chief of Staff of the US Air Force, and only the ashes in Tokyo, only the screams in the canals, only the burned skin of a Vietnamese girl remind us, behind every engineering victory there can be a human catastrophe. Science is not inherently bad, but when it serves war without moral boundaries, it becomes a weapon not only against the enemy, but against humanity itself. You stand again in Tokyo, that same night, the same hum in the sky, but now you know this fire is no accident. It was weighed on laboratory scales, its temperature calculated, its stickiness tested, its target chosen. You look at the running woman with her child and realize she is not merely a victim of war, she is the result of an equation in which human life had no variable. And in this lies the entire tragedy. Not that war is cruel, but that its cruelty was engineered. A diagram, a blueprint, a formula, and hundreds of thousands of lives erased like errors on paper. Even the dryness in her mouth, not from fear, but from the scorched air, where no oxygen remained. We are accustomed to thinking that science is neutral, that formulas have no morality, but this is an illusion. When a scientist creates a weapon, knowing how it will be used, he makes a choice. When an engineer designs a bomb for a specific architecture, he chooses a target. And when a general gives an order, based on these calculations, he chooses the price of victory. Science serving war is never neutral. It becomes part of the flame, part of the ashes, part of the silence, and the question is not whether war can be stopped. The question is whether we want our knowledge to become its fuel, especially when that fuel clings to skin and burns at 1,000 degrees Celsius. Now it's your turn. Before you is a simple yet unbearable question: can the killing of 100,000 civilians be justified for the sake of ending a war sooner? Think, weigh it, and answer honestly to yourself and to others, yes or no. Remember, behind every yes is a scream in a canal. Behind every no is the risk of prolonging the war. But history has already given its answer. It remains to be seen if you agree with it.